In the name of the God who created us, in the name of the Christ who teaches us, in the name of the Spirit who journeys alongside us, welcome home, children of God. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Welcome to First Presbyterian Church this morning as we gather together as God's people in God's name. It is good to be here this morning. I welcome all of you here today. A couple of quick announcements as we continue our worship. If you would please take a moment and sign those blue friendship registers and pass them down the aisle. We would appreciate that. Just a continued reminder, there's more information in your bulletin, but we are continuing to collect goods for ARM for their Thanksgiving boxes. There are collection boxes downstairs and back here as well, Sherry. Thank you. Many of you have already dropped stuff in. Fantastic. Thank you. If you haven't had a chance to, we're collecting for a couple more weeks, I think, but just a reminder to please make those donations. They're very much appreciated when ARM goes to assemble those Thanksgiving boxes to give out. We are live streaming this morning and hopefully with sound again this week. People seem to prefer that when it's not just video, it includes the vocals. So just a reminder, you are on camera and live stream. If you do have, if you are sharing something in worship, reading, speaking, whatever, please use one of the mics up here so we can pick you up. Youth are going to be headed after church today to a Halloween concert given by the Johnson City Symphony. It is a children's Halloween concert at the Milligan College Chapel. That's at 2 o'clock. Lunch is kind of on your own, though. I expect if there are folks that are going and want to hang out and coordinate something together, we can probably make that happen. So if you're planning to go and you want to kind of lunch together as a group, maybe, let's say, meet at the front pew up here after work, and we'll see what folks want to do. But otherwise, the plan is to meet at 1:45 at the chapel at Milligan. Sherry's got tickets for us all sitting together and everything. And it looks like it's going to be a blast. There's trick-or-treating and costume contest at intermission. So anyway, that's the plan for this afternoon. Everyone Counts today. Today is the second Sunday, which means that our Everyone Counts goes to support ARM. Simply by showing up today, we will give $1 for every person here to support ARM. Again, invite you to take part in that act of worship by putting your dollar bill in, but whether you do or not, know that you simply showing up today has made a difference in the lives of people in this community, and for that, I thank you and I'm grateful. Rebecca, I know, is going to share with us in just a moment as she's coming up. You can come on up, Rebecca. Have I missed any announcements? Benediction, thank you. Gosh, yeah, absolutely. Coffee time right after church this morning. Downstairs, there's Peacemaking hosting today. So thank you, Peacemaking, Nancy and Gary, and everybody on Peacemaking for hosting. Stick around after church. Fellowship hall downstairs will have coffee and snacks and just a time to be in fellowship with one another. So please plan to stick around. Anything else? Rebecca.
All right. I'm here this morning to inspire you and remind you that we are currently in the midst of our pledge campaign, and I'm going to ask Julie to start these pledge cards around the sanctuary. Aren't you glad you sat there?
Oh,
Yeah. So if you already have yours at home or you've already pledged online, just put yours in the pew for somebody who might pick it up next Sunday. Our theme this year is One Love, Many Gifts. And as we think about many gifts, what came to me is the diversity of people and beliefs that we bring together in this community. And personally, that's one of my greatest challenges, is trying to figure out why somebody would want to load the dishwasher differently than I do. Or fold towels in some strange and peculiar way. You know, it's hard to embrace people who are different from us. And we have that opportunity every time we aren't looking in the mirror. And I celebrate the life of this church because over and over again, we stop and we listen to each other. We don't all have to be on the same page. We don't all have to be in step with the same ideas. We can think differently, we can believe differently, and we can come together and learn from each other. So that's the primary reason I value this community. So I invite you, as you're considering your pledge, to think about why First Presbyterian is important to you and give generously. Of course, we always want you to step it up just a little bit more and help us continue as we are right now. I'm not sure, has anybody said it? We're in the black. It's a little nervous to celebrate that because we're afraid people will stop giving, but it's a good thing and it's working. So thank you for your contribution.
Please stand as you are able for the invitation to worship. Our culture, founded from oppression, gay is synonymous with the lesser. It's the same hate that caused wars from religion, gender to skin color, the complexion of your pigment. The same fight that led people to walkouts and sit-ins. It's human rights for everybody. There is no difference. Live on and be yourself. When I was at church, they taught me something else. If you preach hate at the service, those words aren't anointed. That holy water that you soak in has been poisoned. When everyone else is more comfortable remaining voiceless. Rather than fighting for humans that have had their rights stolen, I might not be the same, but that's not important. No freedom till we're equal. Damn right, I support it. Our hymn is hymn number 66.
our meditation, we're going to look to a prayer that was written by a young man who came to the West 99 years ago to teach love, harmony, and beauty, to teach that there's one true book about God, the book of nature. He was about, in his, I think, did I say 20? He was somewhere in his 20s when he made it to the States as an Indian musician. And at their very first, this is one of my favorite things about how unprepared we were for Indian music. As they tuned their instruments, when they were finally ready to play, the audience clapped because they thought they had just played. So it's a pretty remarkable thing that he influenced so many people that we're still talking about him all these years later. He has followers all around the globe. His name is Inayat Khan. And the words that I'm going to focus for on our meditation today are, thy light is in all forms, thy love in all beings. Will you say that with me? Thy light is in all forms, thy love in all beings. And we'll use two Arabic words, one that you know, Allah. Say that, Allah. And if you speak Arabic, that's what you call God. Whether you're Christian, Muslim, pagan, I don't know if they have any pagans speaking Arabic, but you would still say Allah. And who is the other word? Who? Who. Spelled H-U this time. And all Arabic, all old languages have multiple interpretations because they weren't as refined as our languages today. So my favorite understanding of who is the mystery, the mysterious face of God that we can't imagine. So how can thy light be in all forms and thy love be in all beings? Who Allah? Who Allah? Who Allah? So go ahead and close your eyes. Wiggle into your meditation posture, that place where your body knows and your mind follows to stillness. And I'm going to sing the chant through the first time. And then I'll ask you to join in with me. We'll sing together. And then I'll close with a portion of Inayat Khan's prayer. So breathing and listening. Thy light is in all forms, thy love in all beings, thy light is in all forms, thy love in all beings. Who Allah, who Allah, who Allah, who. Join me softly. Thy light is in all forms, thy love in all beings, thy light is in all forms, thy love in all beings. whisper. Thy light is in all forms, thy love in all beings, thy light is in all forms, thy love in all beings. Continuing in your breath with the vibration of the sound. Welcoming God in all forms. Resting in that love from every being. Whether it looks like they love you or not. Honoring the mystery, Hu Allah. And in Anayat Khan's words, thy light is in all forms, thy love in all beings. In a loving mother, a kind father, an innocent child, in a helpful friend. In an inspiring teacher, allow us to recognize thee in all thy holy names and forms. Let the star of the divine light shining in thy heart be reflected in the hearts of thy devotees. May the message of God reach far and wide, illuminating and making the whole of humanity as one single family in the parenthood of God. Amen.
The first reading today is from Romans 1, verses 26 to 27. For this reason, God gave them up to degrading passions. Their women exchanged natural intercourse for unnatural, and in the same way also the men, giving up natural intercourse with women, were consumed with passion for one another. Men committed shameless acts with men and received in their own persons the due penalty for their error. Genesis 19, verses 1 to 13. The two messengers entered Sodom in the evening. Lot, who was sitting at the gate of Sodom, saw them, got up to greet them, and bowed low. He said, "Come to your servant's house, spend the night and wash your feet. Then you can get up early and go on your way." But they said, "No, we will spend the night in the town square." Lot pleaded earnestly with them, so they went with him and entered his house. He made a big meal for them, even baking unleavened bread, and they ate. Before they went to bed, the men of the city of Sodom, everyone from the youngest to the oldest, surrounded the house and called to Lot, "Where are the men who arrived tonight? Bring them out to us so that we may know them intimately." Lot went out toward the entrance, closed the door behind him, and said, "My brothers, don't do such an evil thing. I've got 2 daughters who are virgins. Let me bring them out to you, and you may do to them whatever you wish. But don't do anything to these men, because they are now under the protection of my roof." They said, "Get out of the way." And they continued, "Does this immigrant want to judge us? Now we will hurt you more than we will hurt them." They pushed Lot back and came close to breaking down the door. The men reached inside and pulled Lot back into the house with them and slammed the door. Then the messengers blinded the men near the entrance of the house, from the youngest to the oldest, so that they groped around trying to find the entrance. The men said to Lot, "Who's still with you here? Take away from this place your sons-in-law, your sons, your daughters, and everyone else you have in the city, because we are about to destroy this place. The Lord has found the cries of injustice so serious that the Lord sent us to destroy it."
Thank you, Paul and Joan and Choir. That was a beautiful anthem this morning. Didn't know that one before, but I love that. Beautiful piece. And Julie, where did Julie sit down? Thank you for reading those uncomfortable texts. No, it's hard. I was kind of cringing as you read them and thought it's even harder to be standing up there reading them than it is just even listening to them. But thank you for doing that, Julie. The Bible is a dangerous book. I mean, to be fair, any book can be dangerous when we give it too much power. Books like the Bible, the Quran, the Tanakh, the Guru Granth Sahib, or any other book that is believed to be of divine origin can be especially dangerous. In part because we sometimes find that we're willing to let a book stand in for the voice of the divine, even if there are little places that it seems that the book contradicts our experiences of the divine. And you certainly know that the Bible has been used in the past to justify abominable acts, including but certainly not limited to slavery, misogyny, genocide, and of course, homophobia and discrimination against LGBTQ persons. You don't have to come to this church or hang out for too long before you can hear plenty of horror stories of people who have been treated very poorly, discriminated against, or vilified because of their sexuality. All in the name of God, and all justified by a few select verses in the Bible. So one of the big reasons I wanted to pursue this Text of Terror series, and this is sermon, I think, 3 in a kind of a series of texts of terror. It's not because I think I need to try and sway anyone who worships here that God really doesn't care or have an issue about your sexuality. The same way I think Amber's going to preach next Sunday on women in the church. I don't think anybody's going to have a problem in here with the fact that a woman is going to stand up before you and preach on how women should not speak in church. We're already here because we've reconciled that. I'm not preaching this series trying to convince you of anything. But I'm preaching this series rather because I think that our community, the larger community, and our presbytery, the other 61 churches in our presbytery, maybe even our family and our friends and our neighbors, I think there are other people that need to hear the voices that this church has to offer. And so if we reject the Bible outright, if we ignore the Bible altogether, then we have given up our ability to be in dialogue with those other communities, with those other people. We have given up the ability to be in dialogue with people who read the Bible differently than we do. Not only that, it makes it especially difficult to pattern our lives after Jesus, who himself patterned his life around the Holy Scriptures. And so I think it's important that we confront these texts of terror, not because I think you all need convincing that there's another way to read them. You know that. I think it's important for us to confront them because it gives us the ability to be in dialogue with other people who don't read them the same way that we do. It gives us a way to talk to people who read these same texts and see condemnation rather than grace. So for people who think the Bible speaks clearly about homosexuality, they're generally referring to just a small handful of texts in the Bible. So in the Hebrew Bible, there are a couple of verses in Leviticus declaring that a man should not have sex with a man in the same manner as he does with a woman. Setting aside for a moment the fact that that's kind of an anatomical impossibility, given that our bodies aren't made the same, these are texts that all belong to something called the Holiness Code. And I know a few people in here have some history with the Jesus Seminar, with source material. the first 5 books of the Bible, we generally think come from a compilation of 4 sources, J, E, P, and D. So if you've ever heard of those source materials, anyway. The Holiness Code comes from source P, the priestly source. And so there's a very real possibility that everything in the Holiness Code, everything in P, was really only intended for the priestly class to begin with. But whoever they were intended for really doesn't make too much difference, because these Holiness Codes include a whole lot of other things that none of us, even our conservative Christian friends on the other side of the aisle, none of us have a problem ignoring the rest of the things in those Holiness Codes today. We don't have an issue wearing blended clothing. We don't have an issue eating pork or shellfish. At least not most of us, Sarah. I know the pork thing. So why should one verse be the voice of God clearly speaking to us, while the others we are comfortable dismissing as outdated products of their time? Second text is one that comes from another one from the Hebrew Bible that is often cited against homosexuality, is the story of Sodom and Gomorrah that Julie read this morning. And in this story, there are a couple of strangers that show up at the city gates of Sodom, and a man named Lot is the first one to encounter them. And Lot is bound by an ancient Middle Eastern law of hospitality. The only way you could survive, no matter what your ethnicity or religion was, in ancient Middle East, was to depend on the hospitality of others. Right? There weren't restaurants, there weren't hotels. So this hospitality law transcended the different religions in the Middle East, because everybody recognized that you had to depend on hospitality to survive. And so if strangers showed up at your door, you didn't ask what their ethnicity was, you didn't ask what their religion was. You offered hospitality because that was necessary to survive. So Lot does this. He offers these strangers to come in and have a meal and a place to stay for the night. And then later that evening, some men show up at the door, Lot's door, demanding that he send out these 2 visitors so that the men from the town may know them. You are probably aware that when the verb know shows up in the Hebrew Scriptures, it is usually a euphemism for sex. But Lot refuses to send the 2 men out of his house. Instead, he offers up his virgin daughters to satisfy these men. I know. And the next day, God decides he's going to destroy the city for its wickedness, but to let Lot and his family escape. So, just call your attention to the fact that Lot offering up his daughters to sexual violence somehow or another doesn't meet the threshold for wickedness that the rest of the people in the village were guilty of the night before. So setting aside these other morally problematic issues, however, to people that want to argue that Sodom and Gomorrah is a story about homosexuality, that is right there in the Bible, that is very clear, I tell you those are people who have not read their Bible. Because if you turn to Ezekiel, chapter 16, verses 49 and 50. This is part of the Hebrew Bible, right? Ezekiel spells out very clearly the issue in Sodom and Gomorrah. Ezekiel says this was the guilt of the city of Sodom. The city and its inhabitants had pride, excess of food, and prosperous ease. But they did not aid the poor and the needy. They were haughty, and they did abominable things before me. Therefore I removed the city of Sodom from the earth. Now, listen to what Ezekiel says, right? This is a city that had pride, abundance, and prosperity, but neglected to help those in need. So let me ask you, if you're sitting in the pews and you read this story, it's a whole lot easier, isn't it, to make this a story about a small minority of people who are different, and to recognize that this story is meant to confront a city and anybody else who finds themselves in a similar situation, a city of having abundance and yet refusing to help people in need. Sodom has abundance and prosperity, but turns away from those in need. It's a whole lot easier to make it a story that points fingers than it is to recognize that Ezekiel says very plainly this is a story meant to confront all of us who would find ourselves in a similar situation of having more than we need and refusing to help outsiders. Whether it's people who show up at the city gates, or people who show up at the border, or people who show up at the street corner. If we find ourselves with an abundance and refusing to help, that's who should be convicted by this story. Greed, as you know, is a topic on which Jesus has a lot to say, unlike homosexuality. That said, we can dismantle a few more texts in the Hebrew Bible that are even less directly related to sexuality, but let's skip ahead to the New Testament. And so first, let's deal with all the texts in the Gospels in which Jesus condemns same-sex relationships. Okay, now that we've got those out of the way, let's move on to Paul. Paul writes in one place. That was the other verse that Julie read this morning, Romans 1, 26 and 27. Have you ever heard the saying that blood is thicker than water? Anybody heard that? So that was, I remember that as a kid in times like, you know, the afternoon, or it's a beautiful Saturday outside, let's say, and I really wanted to go ride my bike and play with my friends, but it happened to be grandma's birthday or something, or mom needed help around the house. And so the reason you don't get to go out and ride your bike and play with your friends is because blood is thicker than water. Right? You ever heard that expression, at least in a kind of a similar context? So the original proverb, though, actually states the opposite. The proverb reads, "The blood of the covenant is thicker than the water of the womb." So what that proverb actually says is that the bonds that are forged by shared combat, the blood of the covenant, of people who are bound together as an army and fighting, that blood is thicker than the water of the womb. It is thicker than family ties. Right? So it's a proverb that initially meant that your bond with those who you fought alongside of is thicker and stronger than the bonds of family. But somehow this proverb got taken out of context, and then over time came to mean the exact opposite of what it initially meant. I share that because it is the exact same thing when we take two verses in Paul's letter to the Romans and lift them out of context and use them to condemn our LGBTQ family. Because if you want to back up and read those verses in context, Paul constructs an argument that begins early on in chapter 1 and goes through the end of chapter 23. And the first two chapters of Romans are filled with Paul listing out every single failure, vice, sin, whatever he can envision. Read that list. Read Romans 1, 2, and 3. What you'll see is that Paul also condemns jealousy, gossip, falsehood. I dare say not a single one of us in here could read that list and not tick off at least a few boxes. If you've had a really good weekend, you could probably tick off a few dozen boxes. Paul's intent is to make everybody recognize that none of us has lived in such a way that allows us to look down on somebody else. All he is trying to do is level the playing field so that everybody recognizes that we are no better than anyone around us, so that he can then get to his argument for the Romans, which is that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, and so God sent Jesus to raise everyone up. Right? It is meant to be a great equalizer. It is not meant to single anybody out. But lifting out a couple of verses out of context gives us a very disingenuous reading of what Paul writes to say in the first place. But in the same as the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, it is a lot easier to look at some verses and see in them a way to point fingers at somebody else and not to realize that those verses are meant to convict us, not to give us ammunition toward others. I mentioned last week, if we go to the Bible looking for answers, we're going to find something in there to justify anything we want. Homophobia, slavery, misogyny, anything else. We can find a verse or two to justify anything we want to justify if that's how we want to read the Bible. But all of these stories function to their fullest potential. Not when we go to them looking for answers, but when we see in them the questions that they raise for us. Thomas Merton, in his book Opening the Bible, he writes that the Bible really tells us primarily about ourselves. In other words, he writes, if we go to the Bible and ask, what is this book about? The response we ought to hear from the Bible is, who are you? So as with any story, any parable in the Bible, the subjects in the story are not so much the people that appear on the pages. The subjects are the people who are reading and encountering the story. So that how you interpret the story says more about you than it does about the people living in a doomed city thousands of years ago. So along those lines, if you read the story of Sodom and Gomorrah and you come away thinking that the good guy in the story is the one who offered up his virgin daughters to appease the violent mob from attacking his house guests, I gotta say that sounds like you might be the one with the problem if that's the hero of the story for you. It should also make it clear that we are not meant to be taking every detail from the story as direct instruction about morality. Be sure the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah is not about the sin of two consenting, same-gendered people finding love and fulfillment, including sexual fulfillment with one another. Even that text from Paul, even in context, is likely not condemning mutually consensual same-gendered relationships. One of the frequent practices in the Roman Empire in Paul's time was something called pederasty. And it was this practice in which a wealthy older gentleman would take a young boy as his protege, and part of being that protege included fulfilling the sexual desires of the older, wealthy man. And that has a whole lot more to do with an imbalance of power than it does a consensual same-gender encounter. Because we still recognize that there's a problem when anyone in power takes advantage of someone else for his or her own gratification, sexual or otherwise. We still have a problem with that, and rightly so. It's very likely that's the part Paul was condemning. And so I know this whole sermon today is preaching to the choir. I know that. It's preaching to the people. It's preaching about how you need to show up to church to the people that are already sitting at church. If you're coming to church here, you have figured out a way of reconciling these texts in the Bible with our knowledge that God's love is for all humankind and is far more important than any particular verses we could pick out of Scripture. I dare say probably every one of us in here has figured out a way to reconcile those verses. But here's the thing. There are a whole lot of people who haven't gotten there yet. Some never will, and that's okay. But there are a lot of people who have spent their entire lives only hearing one interpretation, who have only ever heard one way of thinking about these verses. And so they end up with a message that God does not love them in the way that God created them. You, I hope, after this morning, if you didn't already, you now have some background to offer a different message. You now have a way to proclaim that the God of the Bible does love people just the way that God created them. I didn't preach this sermon this morning to convince any of you of anything. I preached it hoping to equip all of us to leave here and be better prepared to share that message with others. And so, may God bless you in that endeavor. Please take advantage of that opportunity so that as we meet people, we can share a different message. Amen and amen. I'll admit it was a little bit of a stretch trying to come up with a title for the sermon this week. For some reason, the title God of the Rainbow kept jumping out to me because of the connections to LGBTQ concerns and, of course, the pride flag and everything. But there's also a hymn that has that beautiful line in it, God of the Rainbow. And so I recognize it's a little bit of a tenuous connection, but our hymn of response this morning will be number 22, God of the Sparrow. So let me invite us to stand and join together in singing our hymn of response. We're going to do the last two verses. Oh, you have. No, yours is different. Okay. Sorry. Okay, we will sing the last two. She's got different music than our hymnals. Okay. Please be seated. As Rebecca shared earlier this morning, and as I think about after our sermon, I am so deeply grateful for this community, not just for the church family we have here, but for what we have to share with the community at large. And one of the ways we can do that is by sharing of what we have worked for, our tithes and our offerings, that enable the ministry of this church to hopefully be able to spread a better message as we go out from here. So let's continue our worship as we receive our tithes and offerings. Perhaps some of the most true words that we find in Scripture is that God is love, and those who abide in love abide in you. So help us to recognize that that message of love is the central message, not only of the Bible, but of the Word made flesh in Jesus Christ, who taught us to love one another. Help that to be our goal as we go forth from here. Use the gifts that we offer, both our money, our time, our energy, our talents, to try to make that love more present on this earth. In your name we pray. Amen. So our final hymn is number 754, Help Us Accept Each Other. If you look at the base little note at the bottom that tells you what the hymn is about, it says that this whole hymn is derived from Romans chapter 15, verse 7. You recall that what Julie read at the beginning of the service came from the beginning of Romans. So I want you to hear how Paul ends the book and wraps it up. Paul writes, "Welcome all people in mutual love, just as Christ has loved you for the glory of God." So however you think Paul begins this, understand that when the arc of his argument finishes, is an invitation to love and welcome all people in the way that we have been welcomed. And that's what this hymn is about. So let's sing 754. Just a reminder, continue the fellowship and love that we share here downstairs over coffee and snacks and our benediction. Second, go out to love one another and to love the world as God has loved us. And as you go out today, may the road rise up to meet you. May the wind blow always at your back. May the sun shine warm upon your face. May the rains fall softly on your fields. And until we meet again, may God hold you in the hollow of her hand.